You were listening to Westplex Talk 1045. You're listening to The Farm Show. That's Farm and Ranch, Missouri. I'm your host, John Combest. And today in C Block, our third block here on The Farm Show, we're going to be talking about a deadline that's today. And it's a government deadline that's today. Yes, I know what you're thinking. John, there can't possibly be a government deadline on a Saturday because everybody knows that bureaucrats don't work on a Saturday. Well, that's a pretty good point. But I guess a deadline is automated and it can be set for Saturday. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The deadline I'm referring to is the EPA's public comment period for dicamba rules and regulations going into the 2026 growing season. If you're looking for the proposed rules, you can find them by going to The Farm Show on Facebook. You can find us at Farm Show Radio on Facebook. And a couple days ago, I linked to the EPA docket with the documents. Originally, the EPA set the public comment period to end on August 22nd. And then the EPA extended it to today at 10:59 p.m. Central Time. That's midnight Washington, D.C. time. So before we begin, I have something that we haven't talked about at all in all of our episodes here on The Farm Show since back when we started in July. And that is my significant and serious bias on the dicamba topic. There, I said it. I worked for several years on the dicamba topic. And further, in the confession category, another topic that we haven't talked about on the show yet, I was determined when we started the show that this show would not be about reading my resume. And I refuse to read my resume on this show. But I worked for 12 and a half years at Monsanto/Bayer. And for a majority of that time, my day-to-day job in some form or another, in some way, touched the dicamba topic, specifically communicating about dicamba, about the benefits of dicamba, about the regulatory approval process, about how valuable dicamba could be and should be to farmers. So from 2008 up until about 2016, there were years where the primary part of my job was communicating about dicamba. So I say that, again, not to read my resume, but to tell you two things. Number one, I'm incredibly biased in favor of dicamba. And number two, I spent years working on the regulatory approval pieces, communicating about regulatory approval, the public comment periods, the waiting for the approval, how you communicate to growers about this stuff, the whole kit and caboodle about government regulations and approvals. But I've also seen firsthand what happens when dicamba is not stewarded properly, or when growers don't take dicamba regulations seriously. I think we all know, we're all close enough to it, that we all know what dicamba can do to sensitive crops, or even soybeans that are not dicamba tolerant, if growers don't steward the technology appropriately. I think we've all seen that before. And yes, both of those things can be true. You can be an advocate for dicamba tolerant technology, and you can acknowledge the reality that when not stewarded properly, dicamba can be a terrible thing for sensitive crops. I should also point out one more disclaimer, that although I worked for Monsanto and then Bayer for years, well, let me read this language. No information herein contains material or information not generally known to the public or within the industry, nor proprietary information acquired or learned by the author, that's me, as a result of and during his employment with Bayer. Spoiler, I didn't write that language. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, let's get into the topic of dicamba. We're going to talk about the stuff moving on the dicamba issue that as a soybean grower here in our 4-county area, Warren County, Franklin County, St. Charles County, West St. Louis County, you'd actually be interested in. And the dicamba topic, of course, affects soybean growers all across the country, or even down Highway 55 as you get down to the Boot Heel and the cotton growing areas. But for the sake of our discussion today, we're going to talk about soybean growers and our 4-county broadcast area and what it might mean to them. And because we're all involved in ag here, we don't have to go through a rudimentary discussion of what dicamba is, how it works. I think one bit of history is probably important for context because I know that there are folks who listen to this show who are under the age of 30. 10 years ago, suffice to say, roughly 10 years ago, we had the introduction of 2 popular platforms for soybean growers that were brand new. You had Monsanto introducing its dicamba-tolerant soybean, its Extend system, which was actually for soybeans and cotton, but let's talk about soybeans here. You had Monsanto with dicamba tolerance in soybeans, and then you had Dow, which has since become Corteva. You had Dow introducing its Enlist system, which was 2,4-D tolerant. So both of these companies introduced their seed technology as well as the chemistry technology to go along with it. That's just a little bit of brief history there. And as we know, Monsanto was acquired by Bayer, and Dow and Pioneer merged to form Corteva. So that's just a little bit of history on it. And then as a period of time, back then, we also had the standalone company that was Bayer at the time, had their own system called Liberty. You probably remember Liberty Link soybeans, which is glufosinate tolerance. Let's fast forward to the modern era. Prior to the 2025 growing season, the EPA said that growers would not be able to use in-season applications of dicamba over the top of dicamba-tolerant soybeans. As you can imagine, this announcement had a significant detrimental impact on Bayer. And on their earnings call back in August, the CEO of Bayer, Bill Anderson, talked about the fact that the inability of growers to use dicamba over the top significantly affected seed sales. Then the EPA announced that they would initiate a public comment period based on their draft rules, their draft recommendations for regulations for dicamba. So in other words, these agencies now say that they plan on approving the use of dicamba over the top. Now, if you were a political person, you might say that at least part of this decision is based on a fact that at one point a year ago, we had a different presidential administration. And today we have a different presidential administration, a new administration. There are probably some folks that say, well, maybe that doesn't matter much. But I don't think we can ignore the politics of the EPA and some of these regulations overall. That's not a political statement, by the way. If you want to hear political opinions, listen to the Brad and John show right here on Westplex Talk 104.5 from 7 to 8 a.m., Monday through Friday. I would say that a change in presidential administration certainly hasn't hurt the voice of growers who say that they want access to more chemistry technology. So the EPA comes out with what they say should be the proposed rules and the recommendations for how dicamba should be used. You can read the whole thing by looking at the EPA document. What we'll do for a moment, we'll take a look at the EPA statement. We'll go through this. This was released on July 23rd. Today, the EPA is releasing for public comment its proposed registration for 3 end-use dicamba products for broadleaf weed control and dicamba-tolerant cotton and dicamba-tolerant soybeans. EPA has conducted a robust human health risk assessment for these proposed products and has not identified any human health or dietary risks of concern. Additionally, the agency is proposing to put several measures in place to protect against the ecological risks found in EPA's assessment. These new products would give farmers an additional tool to help manage crops and increase yields in order to provide a healthy and affordable food supply for our country. The EPA continues, dicamba is a herbicide that has historically been used for control of emerged broadleaf weeds in a variety of food and feed crops and in non-agricultural settings. These proposed dicamba products would allow post-emergence applications to dicamba-tolerant cotton and soybean, commonly referred to as over-the-top OTT use. OTT dicamba applications aim to remove emerged broadleaf weed species, particularly those resistant to other herbicides that compete with cotton and soybean plants and potentially reduce crop yield. OTT dicamba products have high benefits in both cotton and soybean for controlling these herbicide-resistant weeds and managing resistance to herbicides in the future. In other words, the EPA there is laying the groundwork for why these tools are important, and I think most of us already know that. EPA has an entire segment about risk assessments that we'll skip, so let's get to the heart of the matter, which are the EPA's proposed recommendations. Here's what they say. Specifically, EPA is proposing the following mitigation measures on the 3 products being proposed. The first bullet, a single-use maximum application rate of 0.5 pounds acid equivalent, or AE, dicamba per acre. Second bullet, no more than 2 applications allowed within a maximum annual application of 1 pound AE, acid equivalent, dicamba per acre from all combined dicamba containing products. So in other words, you can use a pound per acre split up in 2 half-pound applications. The third bullet, prohibition of aerial applications. Fourth bullet, maintaining a 240-foot downwind buffer. Fifth bullet, the spray solution must include an approved drift reduction agent and pH buffering volatility reduction agent added to the tank and higher percentages as temperatures increase. The sixth bullet, temperature-dependent application restrictions to manage volatility. Users have flexibility to implement temperature-dependent restrictions by reducing the percent of field treated, including by using precision agriculture techniques or prohibiting certain tank mixes at higher temperatures. Next bullet, no applications at temperatures above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Next bullet, 3 points of mitigation required based on the runoff/erosion mitigation menu. Next bullet, users must access and follow any applicable endangered species bulletin from Bulletins Live 2 web-based system. Okay, so there's some more about endangered species there. We're going to skip that. Next bullet is about wearing baseline attire. Applicators must wear baseline attire, PPE, etc. And here's where the EPA says they want feedback. EPA understands that the proposed suite of mitigations is not standard and could present operational challenges for farmers. Therefore, EPA is particularly interested in receiving feedback about the temperature-dependent volatility mitigations, percent of field-treated restrictions, and any science-backed solutions to manage volatility. Detailed information about these mitigation measures is available in the proposed decision. EPA goes on to describe next steps. After considering public comments on the proposed registration and the draft effects determinations, EPA will decide whether the registration action meets the standard for registration under FIFRA, which is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act. If EPA determines that the registration action can be granted, EPA will finalize the biological evaluation. If a final biological evaluation finds that dicamba may affect any listed species or critical habitats, then EPA will initiate Endangered Species Act consultation and share its findings with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service, collectively referred to as the services as appropriate. In other words, if there's some bad news coming out, then they got to consult other agencies here. So there's a bit more about exactly what would happen and consulting with the services and the EPA's final biological evaluation. I think we could skip that for now. So let's get back to the public comment period quickly. We're going to go back to good old Gil Gullickson at Wallace's Farmer, who interviewed Brian Neighbor. Brian Neighbor leads North American business at Bayer. Here's what he had to say about the introduction of the technology. You can find this at farmprogress.com. Neighbor says, quote, "We're confident the tool will come back," meaning dicamba in soybeans and cotton in 2026. Neighbor says it will be a highly effective tool and we'll be able to keep it where it's supposed to be. Now, I was planning on reading a few of the public comments here, but we're butting up against time, and I don't think we're going to get the opportunity to do that. You can find, again, the public comments by clicking on the EPA docket. You'll have one tab that says documents, and you'll have another tab that says comments. And you can even do a keyword search. For example, you can enter the word Missouri, and you can see public comments from anyone who mentioned the word Missouri in their comments. You should also note that a number of comments, as you'll see, will be anonymous. Folks who chose to weigh in on this technology and yet somehow didn't want to associate their name with their comment. You'll see a great deal of comments coming from industry folks, associations, commodity groups advocating for this. You'll also, as you might expect, see a number of comments from environmental groups, ecological groups, and even some farm groups. I should say maybe organic farming groups who have been opposed to dicamba technology for quite a while. So here's the bottom line for growers as we butt up against the end of the hour. I wish I had more time to read some of these comments because some of them are pithy. Pithy, not the other sounding word that sounds like pithy. But there were a lot of pithy comments about dicamba here. Here's what it means for soybean growers, and here's what I think is going to happen. I think the EPA is going to approve dicamba for over-the-top use. I think most of the regulations will probably stay pretty much as they are in the document. I think there will probably be some necessary tweaking here and there based on input from industry groups, companies, and maybe some academics. Here's why I think this is great news for growers, for soybean growers in our 4-county area. Not just the industry talking point of, well, choice is always good for growers, and, oh, more tools in the toolbox is exactly what growers need. I think that's true. I think we all take that at face value because it is true. My speculation is that Bayer really wants to get that soybean grower back. Bayer misses that soybean grower. And I think the good folks at Bayer, and let's be specific, maybe Asgrow, I think the good folks at Asgrow have tried to make the argument, you might as well buy our Asgrow soybeans because we have superior genetics, you have great performance. There's other weed control options you can use on your farm, even if you don't have access to dicamba. My guess is that Asgrow will price competitively. They may even be promotional in their pricing, really trying to get that soybean grower to stay either in the fold or maybe come over from the Enlist system. You never know. And if I'm a soybean grower that's been planting Enlist soybeans, I would expect the good folks at Pioneer, the good folks at Corteva, are probably doing some focus groups as we speak and through harvest to see exactly where growers are on this topic. What kind of price point do you need to keep folks in the Enlist fold? Are you at risk at all of losing some of your growers or a percentage of your growers to the dicamba system? I would imagine that both Corteva and Bayer will price pretty aggressively, maybe even promotionally, because they know that there's some growers up for grabs in the 2026 season. And I think that's great news for soybean growers. Maybe not so good for the Corteva and Bayer bottom lines if you got to be promotional, but I think it is great news for soybean growers. That's all the time we have today on the Farm Show. Thank you so much for joining us. As a reminder, you can hear me and my co-host Brad Hildebrand every weekday morning, Monday through Friday, from 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. right here on Westplex Talk 104.5. You've been listening to The Farm Show. That's Farm and Ranch, Missouri. We will see you next Saturday at 10 a.m.